Now, the reality of COVID-19 has hit home for former Mail and Guardian editor-in-chief Khadija Patel. Fortunately, she has recovered from the virus, but many members of her family have actually been affected as well. Her mother is on a ventilator in hospital this evening. And she joins me now. Khadija, thank you very much for your time and for being prepared to share what sounds like a horrific ordeal for your family. I understand in total 10 family members have been affected. Tell us, first of all, about your experience of COVID-19 and how you realized that you had it.
So I had just finished off at the Mail and Guardian at the end of, at the end of May. And I was recently diagnosed with an autoimmune disease, and I had to begin a new course of therapy, which basically was an immunosuppressant therapy. So I was already quite skittish about starting it, and I was advised to self-isolate for the first 2 weeks. And so my mum had actually administered the treatment to me, and the next morning, we got a phone call to say that my cousin had tested positive for COVID. And to this, I mean, it's weeks later, and I still replay that conversation because it still feels surreal. It doesn't feel like it actually happened. I kept thinking there must be some gross mistake. And we had been in touch with my cousin. She's an occupational therapist at the school. As she began going in, her child was here at our house. So, shortly thereafter, my household went for testing. And early the next morning, my phone beeped with a message to say that I had tested positive. At the same time, my mum had also tested positive. And yeah, in those few moments, our entire lives have been upended. As you say, Sally, my mum is in hospital. Fortunately, I did not get extremely ill. I had a fantastic group of doctors and nurses looking after me, monitoring my symptoms throughout the day. And I'm very, very grateful to that. And I asked them to watch Dr. Barrow and Dr. Harron at Donald Gordon, who really helped me very, very well. But Sally, I or at least my symptoms, my COVID symptoms were moderate, but it was still the most ill I've ever felt. And I think that for me, it drove the reality of this disease and how awful it is for everyone.
Yes, and I think, it's interesting you say you were lucky to have only moderate symptoms, but your mother's in hospital, and I understand your brother also got really sick and was in hospital. So how are both of them tonight?
So fortunately, my brother's now being discharged from hospital. He contracted pneumonia. He's at home now recovering. But in recent days, his wife tested positive as well. So, the constant stream of bad news doesn't seem to end. Unfortunately, my mum is still on the ventilator. She's been on the ventilator for over a week now. And it's really, really difficult. And, for families watching people who have relatives in hospital, it is very, very difficult to be going through this at this time.
I can imagine. And I think that it's so difficult. And we know that very often it's families that all get it together. And I think that's partly because when you're emotionally close to someone, it's very hard to keep your physical distance. Would you say that your experience of COVID-19 has completely changed your approach to the disease? Were you always very, very cautious? I'm just wondering, as a journalist, we are there to document and to observe, but when you're drawn into it, does it change your perspective markedly?
The irony is that it was my mum and I who had hardly left the house during the lockdown, and it's she and I who tested positive first. I think what it's changed for me, I think that I always understood the gravity of the disease and its life-changing potential. But I think what it's changed for me is the fact that a lot of the public discussion around it needs to urgently be steered towards compassion and kindness. Every day we're seeing the numbers in South Africa escalating, and we, and as much as this is, a public health emergency, as much as it is an issue for us to ensure that, that the government response is sound, I think that as a society as a whole, what we really need to do is try to understand how do we support each other at this time? How do we ensure that we a compassionate society so that we are caring for people as they combat this disease?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for sharing your story, and I wish your family well. We're thinking of your mother. Glad to hear she's in the care of really good doctors, and thank you for sharing such important lessons with us this evening. That's the former editor-in-chief of the Mail and Guardian, Khadija Patel, who has recovered from COVID-19, but it's had a big impact on her family.